The Haelor Empire was a name whispered in fear across the galaxy. Their fleets were vast, and their ships majestic, massive warships that could level entire planets with a single volley of energy. They had ruled over countless worlds for centuries, conquering and assimilating species into their fold with brutal efficiency. No one ever thought they could be defeated, and that was exactly why the Haelor thought they were invincible. When they turned their gaze toward the human species, they barely gave them a second thought. To the Haelor, humanity was nothing more than a fledgling race at the fringes of the galaxy, their technology primitive, their reach limited. They had heard whispers of human resistance in scattered reports, but they dismissed it as the last throes of a desperate species who had barely survived their first contact with the greater galactic civilizations. They were wrong. The Haelor had never been tested, not in the way that humans had been tested over the past few centuries. Humans were a young species, but they had been thrust into the fire of war from the very beginning, having to fight for their survival against pirates, marauders, and every hostile force that had ever stumbled upon them. And through it all, humanity had adapted. They had learned the brutal art of survival. Where others would have crumbled, humans had risen to the challenge. The Vanguard was a ship unlike any the Haelor had encountered before. It wasn't large or imposing by their standards. It wasn't built for war, but for trade and transport, a humble freighter designed to haul cargo across the stars. It didn't carry the massive cannons or towering shields that the Haelor prized so much, but what the Vanguard had was a crew that had learned to survive by any means necessary, led by Captain Robert Graves, a man who had faced the horrors of galactic space and come out the other side with a mind as sharp as a blade and a crew that trusted him with their lives. The Vanguard had been moving quietly through a relatively uninhabited region of space, hauling a load of resources, when the Haelor cruiser arrived. Without warning, the massive warship dropped out of warp just beyond the freighter's sensor range, its guns already primed and its intentions clear. The Haelor had come to destroy a human vessel, just as they had done to countless others before them. Captain Graves watched as the massive ship grew larger in the view screen. His heart didn't race, nor did his breath quicken. Instead, he felt a calm settle over him. The Haelor had made their mistake. They underestimated humanity, and Graves would make sure they would never forget that. The Vanguard was no ordinary freighter, and its crew was no ordinary crew. Graves knew exactly what needed to be done, and as he issued the orders, his crew moved with practiced precision. They didn't need to talk, they didn't need to hesitate. They moved as one, an unstoppable force, and as the first volley of fire from the Haelor ship streaked toward them, Captain Graves gave the order to evade with a swift command, and the Vanguard twisted away in a series of complex maneuvers that left the Haelor's massive guns firing at empty space. Instead of the target they expected, the Haelor cruiser fired again and again, but the Vanguard danced between the energy blasts as if they were nothing more than harmless sparks. The Haelor commanders watched in disbelief, their targeting systems unable to lock onto the human vessel. No one had ever made their ships miss so completely, and with each failed shot the Haelor began to realize something they had never considered before. Humanity was not the weak prey they had assumed they were. Captain Robert Graves stood at the helm of the Vanguard, his fingers dancing across the control panels with a calm that belied the chaos unfolding outside the ship. The Haelor cruiser loomed large in the view screen, its massive form an intimidating presence in the vacuum of space. But Graves wasn't intimidated. He had faced far worse in his years of service. He had seen ships far more formidable than this one, and had learned to survive by relying on the one thing that the Haelor couldn't seem to account for: the human will to fight. His crew moved around him with precision, each member a seasoned veteran of the stars, and though they had never faced an enemy as powerful as the Haelor, they had been through enough skirmishes and battles to know what was at stake. They were not afraid. They knew the risks, but they also knew that the Haelor had made the mistake of underestimating them, and they were not about to let that go unpunished. Lieutenant Commander Emma Tran stood at the weapons console, her eyes glued to the targeting systems as she tracked the Haelor ship's every movement. She had trained her whole life for this moment, though she had never imagined it would come so soon or under such dire circumstances. The Vanguard was outmatched in every category. It had no shields capable of withstanding the kind of firepower the Haelor possessed, and its weaponry was nothing compared to the energy weapons mounted on the Haelor cruiser. But Emma wasn't worried. Her job wasn't to win the fight outright. It was to survive long enough for the Haelor to make a mistake, and that was something humans excelled at. "Captain, we're losing our window." Emma's voice was tight, but steady, her fingers a blur on the console as she adjusted the ship's targeting algorithms to keep up with the Haelor ship's erratic fire. "Their weapons are locking again. They're going to try another shot." "Not if we can help it," Graves responded, his eyes narrowing. As he focused on the path of their ship, the Vanguard twisted again, this time making a sharp turn to the right. The ship lurched as the thrusters fired in short bursts, the Haelor shots missing again. But Graves knew they couldn't keep dodging forever. They were only prolonging the inevitable unless they acted quickly. He opened the comms. "This is our chance, everyone get ready." He ordered, his voice calm and commanding. "Tran, take out their engines. We need them to stop moving." "Aye, Captain," Tran replied without hesitation, her hands flying over the weapons console. The Vanguard had only one advantage now, its speed and maneuverability. It was small and agile, and if they could land a direct hit on the Haelor ship's engine core, they might be able to buy enough time to escape, or better yet, to turn the tide in their favor. "Target locked," Emma said through gritted teeth. "Firing now." The Vanguard fired a burst of energy straight at the Haelor cruiser's engine sector. The shot hit its mark, and the Haelor ship shuddered as its engines took the brunt of the attack. For a brief moment, the Haelor seemed stunned, their massive ship's movements slowed as power systems began to sputter and fail. The crew of the Vanguard watched in tense silence as their opponent struggled to regain control. Graves took a deep breath and issued the next order. "Now we show them what we're made of." The Vanguard surged forward with renewed purpose, its weapons fully charged, and its crew ready for whatever came next. The Haelor cruiser was no longer moving with the same confidence it had when it first appeared. It had underestimated the human ship, but now the Haelor were realizing the danger they had failed to foresee. The Vanguard had struck a critical blow to their engine sector, and the once smooth coordination of their weapon systems was starting to falter. The ship lurched as power systems fluctuated, and its massive guns began to malfunction. Captain Graves' eyes never left the view screen, his mind working at a rapid pace, calculating their next move. The Haelor were not done yet. He knew that their first strike had done more than just damage the engines. It had thrown the Haelor off their rhythm, and that meant there was a window, an opening he could exploit. For just a few moments they would be vulnerable, and he had to strike while the iron was hot. He glanced over at Lieutenant Commander Tran, who was watching her weapons panel with intense concentration. "How long until we can hit them again?" Graves asked, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of urgency. "Give me 30 seconds, Tran replied without hesitation, her fingers flying across the console. "I can get us in position to fire, but they're already trying to recover. We can't waste any time." Graves nodded and adjusted his course, the Vanguard darting again, this time making a series of quick rolls and sharp turns to keep out of the Haelor's line of fire. The Haelor cruiser's guns fired again, but the blasts missed once more their targeting systems, now struggling to keep up with the human ship's erratic movements. The Haelor were growing frustrated, their efforts to lock onto the smaller vessel failing again and again as the Vanguard danced just out of reach. "Steady now," Graves muttered to himself as he guided the ship through another roll. The crew knew their chances of survival depended on their ability to move faster than their enemy could react. The Vanguard wasn't a warship, but its crew was prepared to fight as if it were. They weren't just dodging, they were outthinking the Haelor, anticipating their next move, and using the enemy's own size and arrogance against them. Emma's voice crackled over the comms. "We're ready, Captain," she said, weapons primed for another strike targeting their command center now. Graves could feel the tension in the air as the crew braced themselves for what would come next. "Do it," he ordered. The Vanguard fired again, this time hitting the heart of the Haelor cruiser. The blast tore through the weakened shields and struck the command center directly. The Haelor ship shook violently, and for a moment it seemed as though the entire cruiser might break apart, but it held together just long enough for the crew of the Vanguard to see the full effect of their strike. The Haelor cruiser's engines sputtered and groaned as they struggled to power up again, but the damage was done. The ship's command systems were in chaos, and its once imposing guns began to sputter out of control as the Haelor scrambled to regain command. Their once pristine warship was now little more than a drifting hulk, helpless and vulnerable. Graves allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, but he knew this wasn't over yet. The Haelor were resilient and would not go down easily even in this weakened state, but the Vanguard had made its mark, and it wasn't going to back down now. "Stay sharp, everyone," Graves ordered, his voice steady and firm. "We've got them on the ropes, but we finish this now." The Haelor cruiser drifted now, no longer the unstoppable juggernaut it had once been, its engines barely functional, and its weapons systems in disarray. The massive warship was on the brink of collapse, and yet the Haelor commanders refused to accept defeat. They scrambled frantically to restore control, their voices sharp and panicked over the comms as they worked feverishly to get their systems back online. But the Vanguard was relentless, moving like a shadow through the stars, exploiting every weakness, every opening that the Haelor had left exposed. Captain Graves knew this was the moment to press their advantage. The Haelor were broken, their pride shattered, and their weapons useless for now. They were helpless, but Graves wasn't foolish enough to think they would stay that way forever. The Haelor were warriors, and they would find a way to retaliate unless he finished what they started. "Tran, how long until their shields are down completely?" Graves asked, his eyes scanning the Haelor ship's hull as the cracks in its defenses widened with every passing second. "Shields are at 20%, Captain, but we can't let up," Tran replied, her voice tight with focus. "They're already rerouting power to the shields. We need to hit them again while they're still vulnerable." Graves nodded in agreement, his grip tightening on the command chair as he plotted their course. The Vanguard shifted once again, its thrusters firing with precision as it danced around the crippled Haelor cruiser, narrowly avoiding a wild burst of energy that had been fired in desperation. The Haelor were throwing everything they had left in a last-ditch attempt to stop them, but their aim was off and the blasts missed by a mile. "We're too fast for them now," Graves muttered to himself as he guided the ship toward the Haelor's weakened flank. "Prepare for another strike, everyone, this is it." Tran's fingers flew over the console once more, her face lit by the glow of the targeting systems, weapons locked and loaded, Captain ready to fire. The Vanguard closed the gap rapidly, now its guns charged with a crackling energy as it zeroed in on the Haelor cruiser's final weakness. The ship's command center was vulnerable, and they needed to hit it with everything they had left. Graves took a deep breath as he issued the order, "Fire now." The energy from the Vanguard's cannons streaked through the cold void of space in a blinding flash of light and struck the Haelor cruiser's exposed command center with the force of a thunderclap. The impact tore through the ship's hull like a knife through paper. The cruiser shuddered and groaned as internal explosions erupted throughout its structure. The Haelor ship's massive frame twisted as its core systems failed one by one, and for a moment everything seemed to slow as the crew of the Vanguard watched in awe. Then the Haelor cruiser exploded in a magnificent burst of light and debris, the shockwave rippling through the nearby space as fragments of the once proud ship scattered across the void. The Vanguard shuddered slightly from the blast, but held steady as the crew watched the destruction unfold. For a moment, there was only silence aboard the Vanguard, the hum of the engines and the soft beeping of the control consoles. The crew exchanged glances as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. They had done it. They had taken down one of the most powerful ships in the galaxy and shattered the myth of Haelor invincibility. Graves allowed himself a brief smile, but quickly wiped it away. He knew that this victory wasn't just about destroying the ship, it was about sending a message to the galaxy and to the Haelor Empire themselves. Humanity was not to be underestimated. "Stay sharp," Graves said, his voice calm but commanding. "This is only the beginning." The aftermath of the explosion lingered in the cold expanse of space. The debris from the Haelor cruiser scattered across the void in a haunting dance, the shattered remains of what had once been an imposing symbol of the Haelor Empire, now nothing more than floating wreckage. The Vanguard hovered at the edge of the wreckage, its crew staring out at the devastation with a sense of disbelief. Mixed with quiet triumph, they had done the impossible. They had taken down the Haelor cruiser, but Graves knew that this victory was only one small piece of a much larger puzzle. He allowed himself only a moment of reflection before turning back to the controls. Trans status on the fleet, he asked, his voice steady as he focused on the tactical map. Now displayed on the view screen, the remaining Haelor ships were still a distance away, but their course was clear. They had undoubtedly noticed the destruction of their flagship and were already mobilizing to engage. 2 more Haelor warships are moving in to intercept, Tran replied, her fingers flying across the console as she analyzed the incoming threat. They're still a ways off, but they'll be here in less than 10 minutes. Graves didn't flinch. He had expected this. The Haelor would not let their pride be shattered without retaliation, but the Vanguard had proven something today. It had proven that humanity was a force to be reckoned with, and the Haelor had made the mistake of thinking they could simply brush them aside. We don't have 10 minutes, Graves said, his voice quiet but filled with a resolve that none of the crew could miss. Prepare for evasive maneuvers and target those ships as soon as they're in range. We're not running from this fight. The crew moved quickly with the kind of fluidity that came from years of working together under fire. The Vanguard was a freighter, not a warship, but it was equipped with the latest human technology, designed for quick strikes and evasion. The Haelor warships were massive and powerful, but they lacked the agility of the Vanguard, and Graves knew that if they could outmaneuver the Haelor long enough, they could take them down just as they had with the first ship. Emma Tran looked up from her console, her face set with determination. "We've got their number, Captain," she said. "If we hit them at the right angle, we can disable their weapon systems, just like we did with the first ship." Graves nodded. "Good then. We'll do just that," he said, and then turned to the comms. "This is a tight one, folks, but we can do it. Stay focused and don't let up." As the Haelor ships drew closer, the Vanguard slipped back into the shadows of space, using every trick in the book to remain undetected just for a few precious moments. Graves knew that their only hope was to keep the Haelor off balance, to strike hard and fast, and never give them a chance to retaliate. The first Haelor warship emerged from the debris field, its massive silhouette filling the view screen as its weapon systems came online, and Graves could feel the tension in the air. The Vanguard shuddered as its engines fired up, and the ship shot forward with a burst of speed. The Haelor ship fired a salvo of energy blasts, but the Vanguard was already gone, twisting and weaving through the fire like a needle threading a tight seam. "Targets locked," Tran called out, "firing now." And the Vanguard's weapons roared to life, releasing a volley of energy blasts that hit the Haelor ship dead on as it tried to track their movements. The Haelor warship's shields flickered and sputtered before failing altogether, and with a single well-placed strike, the Vanguard disabled its weapon systems, leaving the once mighty warship as vulnerable as the first. "Another one down," Graves muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, but the satisfaction was clear in his tone. "One more to go." The second Haelor warship loomed large in the distance, its immense size dwarfing the Vanguard, but the crew of the Vanguard were no longer intimidated by such displays of power. They had already taken down one of the Haelor's mightiest ships and crippled another. They knew this fight was winnable. It wasn't about size or firepower anymore. It was about speed and precision. Humanity had something the Haelor lacked: an understanding of how to use their environment to their advantage. The Vanguard could outmaneuver the Haelor at every turn, and that's exactly what they intended to do. "Engage evasive maneuvers." Captain Tran's voice was calm, but filled with determination, her eyes glued to the sensor array as she tracked the approaching Haelor warship. "They're preparing to fire." Graves didn't hesitate. His hands flew over the control panel, guiding the ship with steady hands as the Vanguard shot forward, once again dodging the first volley of energy blasts fired from the Haelor ship. As the massive weapon systems fired with precision, the Vanguard twisted and rolled as it moved through the fire with agility that left the Haelor commanders cursing their inability to hit their target. "Brace for impact," Graves called out as the ship veered sharply to the left, dodging yet another blast that would have destroyed them if it had connected. "We need to get closer to their weapon systems and disable them fast." Tran's fingers flew over the weapons console, her face illuminated by the glow of the targeting system. "Firing now," she said, and the Vanguard's weapons roared to life, unleashing a barrage of energy blasts that tore through the Haelor warship's shields. The blasts hit the hull with pinpoint accuracy, and for the first time, the Haelor ship's shields failed entirely. "We've got an opening," Graves said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Target their weapon systems and take them out." The Vanguard surged forward once again, its guns firing in rapid succession as it closed the gap between them and the Haelor ship, its weapons delivering another series of devastating hits. The Haelor warship's weapon systems sparked and flickered as they struggled to stay online, but the Vanguard wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Tran's hands danced across the console, once more her voice steady as she watched the weapons display. "We've got them, Captain. Their weapons are down," she said with satisfaction. "They're vulnerable now." Graves allowed himself a brief moment of triumph, but he knew this wasn't over yet. The Haelor were relentless, and they would continue to fight as long as they had the strength to do so. But the crew of the Vanguard had already proven that they could take on the impossible and win. "Finish them off," Graves ordered. "Take out their engines and disable their ability to fight back." The Vanguard surged forward once again, and with a final burst of energy, the ship's weapons fired one last time, hitting the Haelor warship's engine sector directly. The explosion that followed sent a shockwave through space. As the Haelor ship's power core detonated, the remaining Haelor vessel shook violently as its engines were destroyed, and its power grid collapsed. The warship's once pristine form was now reduced to a mass of drifting debris. The crew of the Vanguard stood in stunned silence as they watched the destruction unfold. The entire Haelor fleet had been neutralized, 2 massive warships taken out in under an hour, and the once unbeatable Empire lay broken and defeated at their feet. Graves allowed a smile to tug at the corner of his lips, but he knew the victory wasn't just about the destruction of enemy ships. It was about what this battle represented. Humanity had sent a message to the galaxy. No longer would they be seen as weak or insignificant. They had proven themselves capable of taking on the most powerful forces in the galaxy and emerging victorious. "We did it," Tran said, her voice filled with awe, but also a sense of pride. "We've beaten them." Graves nodded, but his gaze never left the wreckage of the Haelor warships ahead. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "We've got a galaxy to change." The silence that followed the destruction of the last Haelor warship was almost deafening. The shattered remains of the enemy fleet drifted in the cold expanse of space, their once pristine vessels reduced to nothing more than lifeless hulks adrift in the void. The crew of the Vanguard stared at the wreckage, their minds still processing the magnitude of their victory. They had done it. They had defeated the Haelor Empire's strongest forces and sent a resounding message to the galaxy. But amidst the sense of accomplishment, a deeper thought lingered in the back of Captain Graves' mind. This wasn't just a battle won, it was the beginning of something far larger, a new chapter for humanity, one that would not go unnoticed. He stood for a moment in the command center, watching the crew around him with quiet pride, but his eyes never left the wreckage ahead. He knew that while today had been a victory, the war was far from over. The Haelor had lost ships, but they had not lost their will, and it was only a matter of time before they regrouped and retaliated with more force than they could possibly anticipate. The Haelor were a vast empire with resources and power that far outstripped anything humanity had ever known, but that no longer mattered, not in the face of what they had just accomplished. Captain Tran's voice broke through his thoughts. Her eyes were fixed on the sensor readings, the readings that were quickly changing. "There's a large, unidentified fleet approaching from deep space," she said, her tone laced with concern. Graves' heart skipped a beat, but he masked the emotion quickly. "How far out are they?" he asked, his voice steady. "About 30 minutes out," Tran replied. "Their power readings are off the charts. This is unlike anything we've seen before." Graves exhaled slowly as the weight of the situation settled on him. This wasn't just a fleet of reinforcements. It was something bigger, something that could potentially turn the tide of the conflict in the Haelor's favor. If it wasn't stopped, he scanned the sensor readouts himself, and then made a decision without hesitation. "We won't wait for them to reach us," Graves said decisively. "Set a course for their position, Tran. We're going to meet them head-on." Tran's eyes widened at the command, but she didn't question him. She simply adjusted the ship's course and began preparing the vanguard for another fight. The crew moved quickly once again as the ship shifted direction and surged forward. Their weapons were still fully charged, and their engines were running hot, but there was no time to waste. The Haelor may have been wounded, but they were far from broken, and now they were bringing something far more terrifying than they had ever shown before. As the vanguard closed in on the incoming fleet, Graves surveyed the crew, and the readiness in their eyes, he knew that this wasn't just about surviving now. It was about taking the fight to the Haelor. Every battle they fought was a statement, and every victory was a declaration that humanity was no longer just a species to be ignored. It was a force to be reckoned with. "Prepare for battle," Graves said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "This is our moment. We finish what we started." The crew responded with unwavering focus, their resolve hardening with every passing second. The battle ahead would be even more difficult than the last one, but they had already proven that they could overcome the impossible, and they would not back down now. The fleet was coming, and the vanguard was ready to face it head-on. No matter what the Haelor sent next, humanity would stand firm and fight. The dark expanse of space stretched ahead as the vanguard surged toward the approaching Haelor fleet, its engines humming with power. The crew worked in unison, each of them focused on the task ahead. The sense of purpose was palpable aboard the ship, but so was the tension. They had just brought down the Haelor's most powerful ships. Yet now they faced an even greater challenge, a fleet that could tip the balance of the entire war if they were allowed to reach full strength. Graves stood at the helm, watching the sensor readouts as the enemy fleet slowly came into view. It was larger than anything he had anticipated, and its firepower was far greater than the ships they had just destroyed. The fleet was a force unlike anything humanity had ever faced before, but there was no turning back now. They had already made their stand, and there was no retreating from the challenge ahead. "Captain, their lead ship is massive," Tran said, her voice laced with disbelief. "This is no ordinary fleet. It's a war armada. They're bringing everything they have." Graves' eyes never left the view screen, the massive ships coming into view like dark behemoths, their weapons bristling with energy as they moved toward them. "We've dealt with bigger odds before," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "We'll take them one ship at a time, just like we always do." The crew moved with practiced precision. The vanguard had become an extension of their will, a weapon honed by countless hours of training and experience. They knew their strengths and weaknesses, and they knew the enemy better than they ever had before. Humanity had learned how to fight in ways the Haelor never expected, and the vanguard was proof of that. "We're in range," Tran said, eyes sharp as she adjusted the weapon's targeting system. "I can hit their lead ship now, but we need to make sure we don't get caught in a crossfire." Graves glanced at the tactical display, his mind calculating every angle. "Fire as soon as they are locked in, but keep moving. Don't give them a chance to target us back," he ordered, his voice precise as the tension in the air thickened. The vanguard surged forward again, darting between the massive warships with breathtaking speed, dodging incoming fire from the Haelor ships that fired wildly, trying to track their smaller and faster target. But the vanguard was too quick. It twisted and rolled through the blasts, evading each shot with grace and skill. The crew of the vanguard worked together in perfect harmony as the ship danced between the deadly energy blasts. "Firing now," Tran called out as the weapons fired in a flash of blinding light. The blast hit the lead Haelor warship directly at the engine core. The ship shuddered as its power systems began to fail, and the crew of the vanguard watched as the first Haelor ship in the armada began to drift helplessly. "That's one down," Graves said with a grim smile. "Keep pushing forward." But the Haelor fleet wasn't going to go down so easily. The remaining ships regrouped and began to adjust their strategy, now focused on the vanguard. In an attempt to corner it with their superior firepower, Graves knew they couldn't keep dodging forever. They had to finish this quickly. "We've got incoming fire from multiple directions," Tran warned. "They're closing in on us." Graves' mind raced as he calculated their next move. They had one shot to end this. The Vanguard had the speed and precision to defeat the fleet, but only if they could hit them fast and hard enough. "Take us in close," Graves commanded. "Get us right in their heart, and hit their shields with everything we've got." The Vanguard surged forward again, its guns charged and ready, the crew's focus unwavering, as they closed the distance between themselves and the remaining Haelor ships. "We're in range," Tran said, targeting their central command ship now. Graves gripped the armrests of his chair and nodded fire. The Vanguard released a final barrage of energy that slammed into the heart of the Haelor armada. The impact was devastating as the lead command ship erupted in a cataclysmic explosion that sent shockwaves through the remaining fleet. With one shot, the Haelor's grip on the galaxy began to slip, and for the first time in centuries their dominance seemed in question. The crew of the Vanguard stood in stunned silence as the remains of the Haelor armada began to fall apart. The tide of the war had shifted. Humanity had struck a blow that would be felt across the galaxy, and the Haelor Empire would never be the same again. Graves took a deep breath as he looked out at the aftermath. They had done what no one had thought possible. They had broken the Haelor and proven that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. "Mission accomplished," he said quietly. "But this is just the beginning."